Hi, and welcome to He Has Answers, a completely free online ministry resource that, while still very much under construction, contains more than enough information to help you come to know the God who made you, knows you, loves you, and whom wants you to come and know Him so you may be saved and have everlasting life. In this series of videos, we'll be reading through a downloadable PDF file of an unfinished free ebook titled He Is, the Truth that God Exists, and the Thorough Investigation of Undeniable Proofs, so that you can see that beyond a reasonable doubt, God is real and the Holy Bible is His Word. If you'd like a copy of this PDF file for yourself, it can be downloaded here by right-clicking this link and saving the link as is in a folder on your own personal computer or even in your mobile device. Now let's begin. Hi, and welcome back to the reading of the free ebook, He Is, the Truth that God Exists, and the Thorough Investigation of Undeniable Proofs, which is available as a download in PDF from hehasanswers.com. One benefit of being able to listen to audio rather than read through a book is that you can still follow along with the message even while carrying on with whatever else you might be doing in your day. So I invite you to do just that. First, let's pray. God, please give me a soft and humble heart as I listen. Please open my eyes and my ears and change my spirit so I may know you and worship you in spirit and in truth. Part 3, the devil is real and he wants you to go to hell. The dark prophecy is being fulfilled. Crowley's plan for the new age of Antichrist consisted of many points of implementation for it to succeed. But if Crowley was channeling a spirit, then this is obviously truly the spirit's plan and not primarily his own. Now, Horus the child, in which we come to perceive events as a continual growth partaking in its elements of both these methods, and not to be overcome by circumstance. This present period involves the recognition of the individual as the unit of society. He rules the present period of 2,000 years beginning in 1904. Everywhere his government is taking root. Observe for yourselves the decay of the sense of sin, the growth of innocence and irresponsibility, the strange modifications of the reproductive instinct with a tendency to become bisexual or epicene, the childlike confidence in progress combined with nightmare fear of catastrophe, against which we are yet half unwilling to take precautions. Consider the outcrop of dictatorships, only possible when moral growth is in its earliest stages, and the prevalence of infantile cults like communism, fascism, pacifism, health crazes, occultism in nearly all its forms, religion sentimentalized to the point of practical extinction. Consider the popularity of the cinema, the wireless, the football pools and guessing competitions, all devices for soothing fractious infants, no seed of purpose in them. Consider sport, the babyish enthusiasms and rages which it excites, whole nations disturbed by disputes between boys. Consider war, the atrocities which occur daily and leave us unmoved and hardly worried. End quote. My friend, Horus, the child, is the spirit of Antichrist, and Crowley was stating that he was being manifested at the beginning of the 20th century from the time the Book of the Law was dictated in 1904. Notice all of the symptoms we would see in society as this spirit grew in strength and power and established its satanic, spiritual, and perhaps even physical government. Numbness to sin, ignorance and carelessness, quote, strange modifications of the reproductive instinct with a tendency to become bisexual or androgynous, end quote, which is what Epicene speaks of. Quote, childlike confidence in progress, end quote, which obviously translates to mean progress in and of itself is not the answer, coupled with a fear of catastrophe. And we're constantly bombarded with messaging outside of the Bible itself that warns our world is under great threat. He speaks of dictatorships, which we see in various forms around the globe, even health crazes, like we aren't inundated with those as well. Occultism, which is all around us due to it coming in all its forms, and religion, or in this case, which actually matters, or in the case which actually matters, Christianity being rendered impotent by liberalism and flaccid teaching followed by even weaker following. Friend, not long ago at all, I offered up that there's no coincidence between God having warned us against many occult practices and that our inclination to gravitate towards them means indeed we are sinful, and that rebellious spirits working against God are definitely drawing us into these practices, thus, in a way, providing very clear evidence to the devil's genuine existence and interaction with our world. And God's word even warned of a time that would come just like Aliester Crowley has described, after a demonic spirit had communicated just such a blueprint to Crowley on how to bring about the way in this new age by which his coming could be brought about and even sped up. I hope this is becoming all the more disconcerting to you. I hope all this truth being revealed to you about the reality you find yourself in is making you uncomfortable. It should. The linchpin which held that blueprint together was for all of society to accept and follow the credo of this new age. Of this new eon or new age, which is, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. What expression became prevalent and widely accepted in the 1960s? Do your own thing. And what has that devolved into? If it feels good, do it. And now we have each to their own. Once more, the defenders of Aliester Crowley will affirm that any belief that such maxims as these are immoral only proves a complete misunderstanding of Thelema and its aim to unite people by having them synchronously move together and fall into place as we all simply do what thou wilt under love. But friend, we've already looked at the message of the snake spirit who delivered it and its egregious lie of the highest order. Remember the desire to conquer, the bloodshed, the human sacrifices, the shaming and destruction of the Scarlet Woman unless she was a boastful adulterer? The deceit of Crowley and the spirit behind him are so obvious and stupid that anybody who falls for the lies of Crowley wants to. And that is a dangerous place to be because it pits them in the trenches in opposition to a holy God in a war they're destined to lose and be punished for all of eternity. So how do you get people's minds so polluted and open and incapable of right and sensible thinking that they would believe this lie and agree to defend it? One of the main ways is to cloud their thinking and make them open the gates of their mind, protecting their spirit. The first and most obvious ways to accomplish this is by first deceiving them to partake in pharmakeia, that is, to self-administer drugs which alter and open the consciousness of that person. And so we had the drug revolution of the 60s, which coincided with the introduction and embracing of do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Lo and behold, no surprise here, Aliester Crowley was also the father of the modern drug culture. Robert Anton Wilson, who played a leading role in the counterculture revolution of the 60s, wrote in his book, Sex, Drugs, and Magic, A Journey Beyond Limits, quote, Diary of a Drug Fiend played a decided role in developing the philosophy or mystique of the drug revolution. End quote. Well, what was Diary of a Drug Fiend? Diary of a Drug Fiend was Aliester Crowley's first published novel released in 1922. He states in its preface that it was actually a true story but retold with pseudonyms and a few altered details to conceal certain personalities. Inside, we find a character deliver the following lines in a poetic fashion. Quote, "Stab your demoniac smile to my brain. Soak me in cognac, kisses, cocaine. Heart of my heart, come out of the rain. Let's have another go of cocaine. Always go on till you have to stop. Let's have another sniff over the top." End quote. Robert Anton Wilson, who we just mentioned having pointed to this novel, and Crowley as being so influential, would include those very lines of poetry within the pages of his Sex, Drugs, and Magic, right after asserting the book's influence on the drug culture movement of the 60s. Crowley's personal secretary, Israel Regardie, who we've already said wrote his own biography of Crowley, included, quote, "Crowley became an expert at a dozen or so varieties of Hindu and Buddhist yoga. He experimented with more drugs more frequently than anybody in the West before the neurological revolution of the 1960s. End quote. And yes, as already alluded to, meditation techniques involved in yoga also open up our minds to unfavorable spiritual invasion because the gate and the portcullis of the mind's castle are being opened, supposedly, to the universe. This, my dear friend, is why Crowley trained in and mastered these practices, because he wanted so badly to be in touch with his master, the devil. The frequent inclusion of mind-altering substances is, of course, because his master had communicated this, quote, "I am the snake that giveth knowledge and delight and bright glory, and stir the hearts of men with drunkenness. To worship me, take wine and strange drugs, whereof I will tell my prophet, and be drunk thereof. They shall not harm ye at all. It is a lie, this folly against self. The exposure of innocence is a lie. Be strong, O man, lust, enjoy all things of sense and rapture. Fear not that any god shall deny thee of this." End quote. This is the whole verse from the Book of the Law, which I pointed to earlier when unveiling what spirit was actually behind the inspiration of that book, the snake, or Satan. It's quite clear that the devil himself makes a connection between drunkenness and mind-altering drugs, and the sort of false worship he desires, which also leaves people open for communion with him. But this should not surprise you, my friend, seeing as we already discussed some time ago how shamans and witch doctors and all manner of demonically inspired false prophets and mystics have used such substances throughout the ages to contact the spiritual dimension. How twisted that the devil would also wrongfully reassure the world that drugs would not harm people at all, and to be told so is a lie, when the very reassurance he is offering is the lie. And to encourage people to be strong and steadfast and lusting and overindulging in all things, when the very sense of weakness and hesitation they might feel before, during, or after such activity is actually guilt and their conscience at work to make them repent. How diabolical is that lie as well? But what takes the cake has to be this asinine command that no one should fear that such activities would be a cause for any god to deny them, when they are the very things that the one true God demands we avoid, and states emphatically, "Those who practice pharmakeia will not inherit the kingdom of heaven." If you're not willing to accept that the devil and demonic spirits will interact with you while you're under the influence of mind-altering substances, Crowley would interpret the above himself in his book, Diary of a Drug Fiend, when he said, quote, "Let's get back to the words, to worship me. They mean that things like heroin and alcohol may be and should be used for the purpose of worshiping, that is, entering into communion with, the snake that giveth knowledge and delight and bright glory." End quote. Aliester Crowley also once dined with Aldous Huxley in Berlin, and the rumor goes that Crowley introduced him to peyote. Well, we've already discussed how Aldous Huxley was quite fond of mind-altering substances, as well as who he was inspired by, and his friendship with Crowley speaks of the spiritual ilk he belonged to. The demonic agenda to bring in the antichrist by reshaping the minds and spirits of humanity would be furthered by the Harvard University professor turned drug guru Timothy Leary. Leary was also a disciple of Aliester Crowley. As a psychologist and psychotherapist at the school, Leary would test hallucinogens on volunteering graduate students during the Harvard psilocybin project, and later distribute mescaline and LSD to the young of America, encouraging its recreational use, just as we heard was happening in that old documentary concerning mind control and drugs. Although he'd claimed it was for scientific research purposes, the foremost reasons were clearly of a spiritual nature. This wasn't only evident from much of his own speeches and writing, but also as he oversaw the March Chapel experiment, where students with graduate degrees in theology at Harvard Divinity School partook in magic mushrooms to see if it would heighten their spiritual experience and help them connect with God. 9 out of 10 mistakenly reported just that, as what they were actually being open to were pagan gods. All in all, Timothy Leary fueled and propelled the drug-centered culture revolution, just as his mentor Aliester Crowley had channeled, and just as their demonic master had instructed them to do. There should be no doubt in your mind that Timothy Leary knew exactly what he was perpetuating by pushing drug use out into the culture so it would gain mainstream acceptance, leading to widespread use. In a PBS interview on Late Night America, Leary admitted that the plan began coming to fruition in the 60s and that he was carrying on Crowley's work. Quote, "Well, I've been an admirer of Aliester Crowley. I think that I'm carrying on much of the work that he started over 100 years ago, and I think the 60s themselves, Crowley himself had said he was in favor of finding your own self, and do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, under love. It was a very powerful statement. I'm sorry he isn't around now to appreciate the glories that he started." End quote. What we are living in today are the spiritual fruits of their insidious labors. Their desire for the antichrist to arrive in our world will be met more rapidly as more people engage in pharmakeia and open themselves up to the influence of demons. This goes even further than the administering of illicit mind-altering drugs. We've already discussed to some extent how so many of our supposed psychiatric and psychological ailments are merely the manifestations of a real demonic enemy attacking our spirits through our mind. We've discussed how the real, true answer for so many of those suffering is a simple prayer in the submission of their whole life to Christ so that their enemy will flee from them. Yet what is our response? What is the response of our all-knowing doctors, psychologists, and psychiatrists when it comes to conditions like anxiety and depression? Drugs, 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 and more drugs. Drugs which lobotomize a person and neuter their creative ability to think, and tranquilizers which stunt their spiritual susceptibility to what the Holy Spirit is trying to do in them. This isn't the answer to spiritual oppression and bondage, and maybe even possession. And the devil knows this, which is precisely why he's guided the medical field to go down this secular, godless route. And this is why at any given time in Canada, nearly 10% of the people within it from all ages are on antidepressants, be it for even milder forms of depression, as well as generalized anxiety and social phobias, when God's word says repeatedly, "Be of good cheer," and "Do not fear," and "Do not worry." Once more, this is not to say that there isn't a time and a place for such medications, and God has surely, in His grace, ensured we would discover and develop them for our use when necessary. But when He's never even invited into the equation to be tried and tested as the solution, it's obvious that their overuse is rampant and being taken advantage of by the devil, who wishes so deeply to distract people from ever consulting the great physician and wonderful counselor in times of need, which could very well lead to their eternal salvation. Look around you, my dear friend, and you will see that it is impossible to ignore that Crowley's forecasted spiritual condition of our world is becoming more and more true. At the time of this writing, we are mere days away from the widespread legalization of cannabis usage in Canada. Along with this attitude of "do as thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," which became "do your own thing," and "if it feels good, do it," and "each to their own," empowered and inflamed by a tsunami of drug use, came the inevitable sexual revolution of the 60s, It was called a liberation movement, but there was no liberation for anyone who involved themselves in it or would later be influenced by it. Only spiritual enslavement occurred. It is safe to say, then, that Crowley had just as much influence on the sex revolution as he did on the drug revolution. He also knew that in order to establish the new age of Antichrist, he would have to destroy God's design for family consisting of men and women as husband and wife. We saw that where one of the desired and manifesting symptoms of the new age was described as, quote, the strange modifications of the reproductive instinct with a tendency to become bisexual or epicene, end quote. Crowley's title for chapter 52 of Magic Without Tears would declare, quote, family, public enemy number one, end quote. Oh, that sounds like some real do-it-you-wilt shall be the whole of the law under love, doesn't it, my dear friend? Yeah, right. What a demonic con artist this fool was. God loves the family. He designed the family. And it is not to be trifled with and rearranged to fit our own debased desires conjured up within our own finite and limited minds. So naturally, Crowley would write, quote, think what horrid images it evokes from the mind. Not only Victorian, wherever the family has been strong, it has always been an engine of tyranny. Curse them! They are always in the way to the performance of this work. Speaking of the New Age, under the Antichrist being ushered in, the nearest obstacle and the most obvious is the family. End quote. He'd speak of the obstacle like so, quote, the whole strength of the family is based on the fact that it cares for the family only. Therefore, its magical formula, thus concentrated, is of necessity hostile to so exclusively individual an aim as initiation. End quote. As vile and backwards as it is to vilify the family for caring for itself, which actually strengthens neighborhoods and societies and whole cultures as God intended, Crowley, and thus Satan's aim, is for families to be weak and broken apart. Otherwise, the initiation of people's conscience evolving to the false reality that it must do what thou wilt within Telema, which is merely self-worship fostered by self-interest, can't happen. Members in a family, specifically the mother and the father, must not be consumed with selfishness and self-interest, or they will not foster the healthy bonds and growth necessary for a family to be strong and for the children to grow up emotionally healthy. It makes sense then that we see systems all over this world trying to raise people's children for them and indoctrinate them as if children don't belong to a family, but to the nation or world itself. Gotta break down those families. It's also no wonder we see the epidemic of divorce that we do, and why God would so clearly define marriage as an unconditional covenant that was meant to last for life for the sake of the man and woman involved, as well as any children they had, and as well for the good health of society. And it's also why we see the total rearrangement and redefinition of what family is. We've got weird communal situations where everyone's a family, and the children have multiple mums and dads, who also sleep with each other and swap partners, of course. Mums who are actually biological men partnered up with dads who are biologically women, and then are impregnated so the couple can carry their baby, as well as two mums or two dads, as if this new normal is perfectly feasible and acceptable. Friend, I understand that everyone wants to be loved and have a family and be married, and these are very normal desires which I believe are inherent and intrinsic within us as we're made in the image of God, who is clearly revealed as a relational and familial being. But God has declared what constitutes such a thing, and He, with His omniscience, has made an unbeatable and incredible layout for what a family should look like and operate as. And we as a society are being deceived and guided by Satan into a destructive system. Guided by Satan into a destructive system that denies God the glory for His perfect planning and therefore gives honor to Satan in our do what thou wilt mindset of rebellion. God doesn't deny relational and familial love to anyone. He simply says it's got to be constructed his way. And guess what? That's also the best way for families, parents, children, and our society, all while helping people come to know and honor God, while restraining the devil and his forces from coming to rule this world. And just in case we've so quickly forgotten that Aliester Crowley was working for the devil, his dedication of the world's tragedy went like so. Quote, I owe this book, as all that I possess, to my playmates in the garden of Eros. But they are rich, they want for nothing. Therefore I give it to the poor boys and girls of England, so that, shaking off morality and religion, they may be partakers in love unto the glory of Pan. End quote. We've already seen in the Book of the Law that the snake spirit wanted sex done as worship to himself. So who are children and men and women supposed to be partakers in love unto the glory of Pan, having sex to after abandoning immorality and religion? Well, Pan was a mythological, lecherous goat man and god, often depicted as a satire. Once more, we see the connection of demonic, satanic, false god worship in Crowley's thinking and writings. It should also be noted that the word eros he uses above is the Greek word for sexual, romantic love, and we do not see it anywhere in the Greek New Testament, but only in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, for example, in the Song of Solomon, which speaks of the intimate and spiritually covered love between a husband and a wife. But Crowley, as would be expected, shares such love with other playmates who are wealthy and indulgent in their garden. It's highly doubtful that the love he speaks of offering to this sick and lecherous god called Pan is real, true love at all, but only perversion which the devil savors so strongly. Yet this is the sort of love that is born out of rejecting the social, moral norms which have come about thanks to the teachings of God in His Word and the transformation that had come to the world through Christ and the sharing of the gospel by His disciples. Yet this is what Crowley invites the youth of England to partake in. What else was the snake spirit guiding his prophet Aliester Crowley to tell the world regarding sexuality to speed up the coming of the Antichrist? As mentioned, bisexuality would be a physical fruit of the spiritual movement. But let's go to the horse's mouth to see what else. Quote, "Let me seduce the boys of England. I shall fight openly for that which no living Englishman dare defend, even in secret. Sodomy. And in truth, there seems no better way to avoid contamination of women. Sodomy is an aristocratic virtue, which our middle class had better imitate if they wish to be smart." End quote. He goes on to list a series of men he ascribes to be, quote, "great men," end quote, and declares that they were all, quote, "sodomites," end quote, as if there's a surefire connection between anal sex between men and his idea of greatness. Actually, I suppose in Crowley's depraved mind there would be. It should be clear then, my dear friend, that the escalation of homosexuality would also necessitate the coming of the Antichrist. Should this shock us, though, when we covered already that homosexuality was yet another sexual practice prohibited by God due to its spiritual occult ties to Satan? No, it really shouldn't. Now, my dear friend, please don't be confused by Crowley's above statement that seems to exalt homosexual relations between men as a virtuous activity. Having been initiated into the secret order called the Order Templi Orientis, the Order of the Temple of the Orient, OTO for short, Aliester Crowley would rise in prominence and quickly expand their sexual ritual magic to include what he considered more, quote, transgressive, end quote, sexual acts such as homosexuality in order to evoke more powerful a demonic effect. As graphic and revolting as it is for me to write and for you to read, he believed that the excreted blood and trace amounts of feces that tends to accompany homosexual sex attracted demonic spirits, quote, while the sperm kept them alive, end quote. Now, does that sound virtuous at all to you? I highly doubt it, and Crowley knew it, and that's why he pursued it and actively encouraged it. Harry Hay may not be a household name to you, my friend, but as a young man he'd play the organ at the Los Angeles Lodge of the Order Templi Orientis. Quote, Aliester Crowley's notorious anti-Christian spiritual group, a secret society known to have created homosexual sex magic rituals. End quote. It's no doubt whatsoever from Hay's life and beliefs that the occult and the mysticism therein was a major influence on him. As a homosexual and organizer for homosexual rights, he would become the, quote, founder of the modern gay movement, end quote, and put homosexuality at the political forefront during the 60s. In his own book, Radically Gay, he states of homosexuality, quote, our beautiful, lovely sexuality is the gateway to spirit. Under all organized religions of the past, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, there has been a separation of carnality, or shall we say, of flesh, or earth, or sex, and spirituality. As far as I am concerned, they are all the same thing, and what we need to do as fairies is to tie it all back together again. End quote. The book, published in 1996, states that since 1991, Hay has held yearly sex magic workshops to explore these spiritual gateway potentials with other gay men. In the same book, Harry quotes Crowley's book of the law when he writes, quote, come forth, O children, under the stars, and take your fill of love. End quote. Friend, is it obvious, then, what spirit was behind Hay and therefore the movement he would be the catalyst for? If nothing else, it was obviously not the Holy Spirit of God or those aligned with him. But then what other spirit, if all other contradictory spirits are opposed to God? A name you're likely more familiar with is Dr. Alfred Kinsey. He's the American biologist turned sexologist who apparently conducted thorough and honest and purely academic research on a wide scale with no agenda whatsoever, and arrived at wholly objective, truthful, and altogether groundbreaking conclusions about our culture and human sexuality therein. He would first release those conclusions in his book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, in 1948. From then on until his death in 1956, he traveled the world advising governments on how they could modernize their antiquated sex laws. His advice was integral to updating our sexual attitudes, and those conclusions are what has paved the way for how sexuality has morphed over the last 60 years. But his research was carried out with an agenda, and he purposefully skewed it all along the way in order to arrive at untrue conclusions, in order that the course of human sexuality would be altered for the worse, all while he thought, in his warped mind, it was being altered for the better. According to Kinsey biographer Jonathan Gaithorne Hardy, Alfred Kinsey grew up in the slums of Hoboken, New Jersey, in a poor, restrictive, and repressive Christian Methodist home. Not that the Methodist denomination itself is wrong, but his parents themselves were so repressive, not just with sexuality, but all things, that they were described by Gaithorne Hardy as nearly friendless. Because of all this, in Kinsey's 20s, having gone off to college, he abandoned whatever faith he may have had and turned with fury on religion. Unfortunately, this anger towards the repressiveness he experienced and blamed religion for remained with him his whole life, and even his close colleagues believed it is what fueled his research. That's not to mention that through his research and sexual involvement with both his male and female research That's not to mention that through his research and sexual involvement with both his male and female research staff, in the name of good objective scientific inquiry, of course, he'd come to believe that he was actually gay. Before long, he'd begin living a double life. The laws of the time which prohibited sodomy certainly played a part in his desire to see all, yes, all, sexual depravity as acceptable and tolerated as mainstream. Of the 5,000 or so, quote, sexual histories, end quote, Kinsey's first book on male sexuality was based upon, 1,400 of those interviews came from prisons scattered over a dozen states. In these prisons, there was a much higher instance of homosexual relations due to the inmates engaging in that activity for the sake of sexual gratification, and as many as 44% of those prisoners surveyed were involved in such activities. On top of that, this sampling was contrived primarily of sex offenders. Even when they weren't, violent offenders and anyone locked up in prison prove by their very incarceration that they are dysfunctional members of society with little forethought of consequence, and their sexual behaviors are not at all likely to be a true representation of your average male. They are therefore not indicative of reality, and such a large sampling would have, no doubt, distorted Kinsey's findings. It's inconceivable that Kinsey would not have realized this. In fact, one of his lead researchers, Paul Gebhard, who we'll discuss more shortly, would later confide that they purposefully sought out sex offenders, especially the rare types, quote, in order to maximize the statistical magnitude in the general population of deviancy, end quote. From this skewed research, they dubiously pronounced that 10% of all men were gay. Do you ever recall hearing that seemingly enlarged number floating around? Obviously irrespective of reality, but its existence as purported fact has influenced and shaped the thinking and behaviors of many people. Kinsey's non-imprisoned interviewees would come through introductions from contacts his team had made while accomplishing the prison surveys, and he says this in page 38 to 40 under the Mail Report. How does one get a good and fair representation of the common American man this way? Clearly, he had no desire to. For whatever reason, a fellow psychologist, Louis Terman of Stanford University, took Kinsey and his poor execution of research to task, and he began a publicized debate with Kinsey. Terman would point to the issue of the above when he wrote, quote, the author lists, page 39, 32 groups of contact persons numbering many hundred, in all who helped in obtaining volunteers. 7 of these 32 were delinquent groups: male prostitute, female prostitutes, bootleggers, gamblers, pimps, prison inmates, thieves, and hold-up men. These presumably would have brought in others of their kind, but in what numbers they did so, we are not told. End quote. Great way to get a fair and honest look at sexuality in America, no? Hardly. But that's not all, friend. If it wasn't sinister enough for Kinsey to skew his research in such a fashion, he had much darker aims as well. Contained in his deceitful first book on male sexual behavior is a chapter number 5 titled Early Sexual Growth and Activity. In it we find several tables of research findings regarding the responses found in children. The graph tables used identical criteria as those for adult subjects. If you aren't interpreting what I'm saying here, my dear friend, Alfred Kinsey had used so-called data involving the sexual stimulation and responses of children. At a minimum, from studying all of the charts, some 300 children were involved, some as young as only 2 months old. Imagine that for a moment. How is it possible whatsoever for a 2-month-old to consent to such experimentation? Kinsey attained this information through the cultivation of relationships with habitual child molesters. These pedophiles would provide him with accounts of their abuse of children with their own interpretations of the children's sexual development based on their perceived enjoyment. In June of 1944, Kinsey traveled 1,800 miles from Indiana to Arizona, where he would have a clandestine meeting with a man who would become his prime source of these alleged child sexuality records. That man had kept descriptive journals for over 2 decades, and due to the illegal nature of the content, had buried them in the desert. But Kinsey had persuaded the man to retrieve them and pass them on to him for study. For 3 more years, Alfred Kinsey would regularly correspond with the donor of the journals. This man was a U.S. government land examiner named Rex King. Kinsey would give him the code name, Mr. Green, to protect his identity. King's job naturally took him across Arizona and New Mexico, and on these taxpayer-funded trips, he would prey on children and collect his own samplings for study. In total, it is believed that he molested at least 800 boys and girls while recording the details in those explicit handwritten diaries. Kinsey had come to know about King from his own mentor in sex research, Dr. Robert Dickinson. Dickinson had collaborated with the pedophile King via written letters for several years and even taught him how to record his child abuse in specific, scientific detail for the sake of future research. How empirical. Kinsey Institute researcher Paul Gebhard would tell of how King was taught to time and measure in minute detail every bit of data pertaining to these predatory encounters, and that, quote, it encouraged him, end quote, referring to King. If someone is a narcissist capable of sexually abusing children, then the knowledge that their abuses would be passed on to the world would obviously encourage them. Dickinson's own excuse that King should, quote, at least do something scientific with it, end quote, points to the fallacy that great good could actually come from molesting children, and this certainly played on King's ego. Why on earth would Dickinson say something like that to an active pedophile when the right response was to call the authorities? Kinsey would include King's findings in sexual behavior in the human male, not divulging them as claims of a self-professed child abuser, but as the first ever scientific proofs that children were inherently sexual beings from birth. With no independent corroboration, he published King's detailed descriptions of what the pedophile claimed were orgasms experienced by the hundreds of children he had abused. Without being able to check these claims, Kinsey reproduced them as scientific fact. Why? Because he had an agenda to destigmatize sexuality in society due to resentment over his own repressive upbringing. The Kinsey Institute for Research in Sex has worked for decades to exonerate their hero, especially after Kinsey, Sex and Fraud, The Indoctrination of a People, was released in 1991 by Dr. Judith Reisman and other whistleblower doctors. Their book served to plainly unveil the crookedness behind Kinsey and his research. The feeble attempts to defend Kinsey's judgment regarding Rex King continued and can be seen in a 1998 investigative episode of Secret History from the United Kingdom called Kinsey's Pedophiles. During the interview sequences with the director of that time, John Bancroft, it's evident that he's very cautious and measured when speaking of Kinsey's involvement with King and King's diaries. Bancroft offers that Kinsey's own belief was that as a scientist, it was not up to him to make moral judgments regarding King's actions. Bancroft shows his hand, though, and clearly agreed with Kinsey's twisted logic when he says of Kinsey's decision not to notify authorities, quote, it's inconceivable that one could do research in that way, give people guarantees of confidentiality, and then when they've given you the information say, well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to report you to the police. That would be immorality in my book of the highest order, end quote. Really, Mr. Bancroft? Higher than, say, having molested over 800 children in a 20-year period? Now that is what's inconceivable. But the Institute excuses both Kinsey and themselves by adhering to the claim that King had long since ceased his habit of sexually exploiting children before meeting Kinsey, and he'd only wanted to help their research while being guaranteed legal immunity. At the far reaches of rationale, that almost sounds reasonable, except that the Institute refuses to release any of King's detailed, date-laden diaries for public scrutiny in order that such a claim be substantiated. Biographer Gaithorne Hardy was able at one time to convince the Institute that he himself was a trustworthy fellow aligned with their cause. He'd eventually be permitted to see a number of different secreted documents, including notes regarding King's diaries. All the while he was taking his own notes. The instructions to members of the Institute, which Gaithorne Hardy copied out, stated, quote, don't reveal that he, King, went on gathering histories until 1954, end quote. And this seems to suggest strongly that Rex King was actually still active as a pedophile up to 1954. This is more than 10 years after first meeting Kinsey. Are we really to believe he'd stop journaling abuse and the preceding journals only contain data collected from interactions with people of legally consenting ages? Not at all. You see, friend, the Kinsey Institute was also collecting surveys and data and accounts from many other active pedophiles as well. They were also receiving data from an American pedophile organization of the time. These were people who had not been incarcerated but were interested in sharing their stories too. And this no doubt further encouraged child abuse. But it didn't stop at the shores of North America. Kinsey was also corresponding with a senior Nazi Party official, Dr. Fritz von Bulischek, in Germany. Von Bulischek had been a stormtrooper before World War II and was assigned a position overseeing a ghetto during the war. In that time frame, he sexually abused hundreds of boys and girls. He'd even sent some of his personal research diaries to Kinsey across the Atlantic. Von Balusek would eventually be arrested for all of this sexual abuse, some of which was happening while communicating with Kinsey. Due to this, investigators from Interpol, an international police agency, would contact Kinsey with the aid of the American FBI and demand that Kinsey send back von Balusek's diaries as evidence. Kinsey would refuse. The German presiding over von Balusek's eventual trial is recorded as having stated, quote, "I had the impression that you got to the children in order to impress Kinsey and to deliver him material." End quote. Von Balusek would reply, quote, "Kinsey himself asked me for that." End quote. Once more, if the truth was being told, it would mean that Kinsey was unapologetically involved in the sexual abuse of children. The quasi-scientific directions for how to record the encounters would have likely been given by Kinsey himself. Regardless of how Kinsey's Institute defends him, he was clearly responsible in part for the ongoing harm done to children. It's likely of no coincidence that in 1955, while von Balusek was awaiting incarceration, Kinsey took a flight from Italy north to Frankfurt, where von Balusek's office was. A complaint would be lodged that late in the night, someone had illegally entered that office and remained there for some time. The next day, Kinsey would fly on to Spain. Why did he stop in Frankfurt first? Especially when the Stuttgart and Munich airports were closer and more serviceable in those days. The reason seems obvious, and none of Kinsey's letters to von Balusek would ever be found there in that office, most likely because Kinsey had gone to recover them to protect himself and his influence on sexuality. When one closely examines all of the tables from Chapter 5 which dealt with early sexual development, it is entirely possible that some 1,200 children were involved in the molestations to acquire that data. It's hard enough to fathom how Kinsey could permit such abuse to occur and then justify it. What's more difficult is to understand that he has research staff to this day defending it all. If you choose to view the cited investigative documentaries I've sourced from, which I will include at the end of this segment, you will see and hear firsthand the tolerant and even accepting or dismissive attitudes of Kinsey's colleagues. It demonstrates perfectly just how debased and depraved the mind can become when we do not say no to wrong thoughts and fantasies coming into it for decades at a time. Senior member of the team, Paul Gebhard, would speak distastefully of what he felt was sexual repression during the days of their research. He would lump together the illegality of premarital sex with adultery, but also with bestiality, and go on to say that calling them all wrong was oppressive. That would seem to indicate that he was open to bestiality. It doesn't stop there, though. He would even go on to say bemusedly, quote, "If you tried petting," referring to manual sexual stimulation with the hands, "you had to be very careful of the age of your partner, or you would be contributing to the delinquency of a minor." End quote. Be careful? Why would anyone be manually stimulating a minor? And why is abstaining from doing so seen as repressive to him? When discussing Rex King's abhorrent sexual appetite, rather than be visibly repulsed, Gebhard can't help but chuckle about what King's thought was, quote, "ordinary behavior," end quote. Gebbard can't help but chuckle about what King thought was, quote, ordinary behavior, end quote. He'd continued to do so while smiling when stating that Kinsey's prime pedophile sources, quote, interest in sex was his main hobby in life. Everything was a sexual object for him. He was interested in having sex with men, women, and children, and animals. He was just curious to see what would happen, end quote. Regarding Interpol's demands that Kinsey turn over Fritz von Balussek's pedophile diaries, Gebbard seems to recollect with great humor that his team lead's response, which of course was an illegal obstruction of justice and would aid a pedophile, was, quote, absolutely not. This is completely confidential. We'll destroy it before giving it to you, end quote. Research colleague Clarence Tripp is another example of a mind utterly misconstrued. With no sign of distaste, he'd inform the investigative journalist of Secret History that pedophile Rex King had his first intimate sexual contact with his own grandmother. He goes on to say that looking up the family tree, he'd had sex with nearly all 33 members of it. Tripp recalls that King had been sexually involved with over 600 boys and girls who'd yet to even arrive at puberty. Completely undisturbed, he can be heard explaining that King had clearly accumulated all of his pedophilic sexual encounters through consent because, in spite of, quote, even a whimper out of a child landing you in jail, end quote, there was never a charge laid, nor was he ever arrested. Saying with a smile, Tripp finally states that, quote, all the children thought he was wonderful, end quote. And then, stifling a laugh, he goes on to say, quote, all the mothers thought he was wonderful, end quote. Tripp finishes this retelling that there was allegedly only ever one complaint, and it came from a young girl who'd consented but then cried out in pain, not because of a change of mind, but only because King was larger than her small adolescent genitalia, and there was, quote, a fit problem, end quote. My dear friend, is this registering with you? Do you not see great issue with all of this? These are the very people who have determined what is right and wrong sexually for our society, but they are clearly and unapologetically, irrevocably disturbed. But their influence has shaped government laws and sex educational policy for decades. Concerning their involvement with Rex King and other active or non-imprisoned pedophiles, Gebbard would admit, quote, it was illegal, and we knew it was illegal, but it was very important for people to study childhood sexuality, end quote. Thankfully, some of Kinsey's team would object to the use of data collected on a 2-month-old baby boy. One such researcher was Vincent Nowless. Clarence Tripp would say of Nowless, quote, he was damaged in childhood by all this morality, and then he had this peculiarly moralistic wife. I'm understating it. And through all this, it sounded to him like pure sin, end quote. Well, that's because it was, Clarence. And I can't help but assume Tripp's low view of Nowless's wife wasn't because of some bizarre prudishness, but more likely due to an unwillingness on her part to indulge in the wife-swapping experimentation that the research team had been involving itself in under Kinsey's guidance. In any case, although Nowless and a minority objected to the inclusion of King and other pedophiles' data being included, it was only to a minor extent because it involved the abuse of them. Primarily, their objection was due to the experiments occurring without objective scientific witnesses, and that they found measurements like measuring an infant's time to orgasm down to the fraction of a second rather absurd empirically and altogether irrelevant. They were more worried that such relevance would damage the credibility of Kinsey's book. Imagine that, friend! Being more concerned over how the data of child rape is collected and notated rather than the child rape itself. Just insane. And an even larger lack of continuity to their thinking was that they've argued that this data was just too critical to stop the pedophiles. Director John Bancroft would say, quote, I think people have got to ask themselves the question, do they believe that research into sexuality should be done or should not be done, particularly research into sexuality that might be in some sense illegal, end quote. When asked by the Secret History's interviewer if the cost remains that more children will be victimized, Bancroft replies, quote, consider the cost of remaining in ignorance. Unless we know about these behaviors, we'll be in a much worse position than if we have more information about them. That was Kinsey's view. End quote. I think I can safely say for both you and I, friend, that neither of us needs to know about the supposed orgasms of a 2-month-old baby, or even that of a 16 or even 17 or even 26-year-old. None of that has any relevance or use in reality. And certainly not in sex education classes for children. People have been doing well for eons without such information, and any sense of confusion or repression was not because the Bible or true Christianity stands in opposition to good, healthy, pleasurable sexual relations between a man and a woman. That's made plain from the explicit, yet poetic writings found in the Song of Solomon in the Old Testament. I mean, I can remember being maybe 12 and watching a video in sex ed class of a penis ejaculating into the vaginal canal. Really? Was that really necessary? When a child asks, "Where do babies come from?" you don't sit them down to watch something like that. And seeing it at 12 doesn't help anything later. You can explain it without such graphic content, and it can all be explained without graphic drawings even. Drawings that only serve to stir up curiosity in the minds of children and lure them to investigate more on their own through the internet. Nobody's not going to know how to have sex because they didn't go through the sex education system. And as adults, if people want to know more, they'll have the opportunity and right and ability to go read books and study the topic or be informed about it by their doctor. No, all of this has obviously been an agenda to demoralize and desensitize our society so that the boundaries that were there for good reason would come down just as they have. But this isn't the only area that Kinsey Institute's explanation for not informing the authorities on active or freed pedophiles breaks down. As already mentioned, they were already surveying incarcerated sex offenders and child rapists, and so they had no excuse to give immunity to pedophiles in exchange for their information. They could have simply gone on gathering what they considered crucial data for understanding the human sexuality of minors from the prisons. But they didn't. And based on their laissez-faire attitude towards child molestation, I'd say it revolved more around the fact that they didn't see anything terribly concerning about it, and thought it would be healthy in society if it no longer carried the deserved stigma that it did. And you'll see this was certainly true shortly. What I can't help but ask is, how did no one at the time of sexual behavior in the human male not shout from the rooftops that Kinsey and his team were abetting criminals? Why was there no prompt and thorough inquisition into where Kinsey got the data for tables 30 to 34 in chapter 5? Why was there no outcry from the masses that this book and the research in it must be a deplorable fraud, and that any and all of what is in it was to be avoided like the plague? Kinsey was lauded all around the world in the media for that book, and although it was roughly 5 times more costly than other books of the day, it sold 300,000 copies. People were gobbling it up. Well, for those who want to know the truth, you don't have to dig very far to see some very grim and alarming realities behind how Kinsey's sexual reformation got off the ground and then took off to change the world. But ignoring all that, I will simply offer that the people who read the book were so clouded by their own desire to give in to their lusts and passions, which all the other chapters justified, that they were able to completely overlook the gruesome realities the chapter on childhood sexuality divulged. When people want an excuse to sin, anything can justify their means to an end. If you find it hard to believe anyone would have missed the obvious if it was plain to see, just Google Kinsey Chapter 5, Table 34, and read the collected data for itself. It's graphic and revolting and disheartening, and I won't reprint it here, but people wanted to ignore the molestations as they took hold of and promoted Kinsey's book. Take, for instance, Table 31, Pre-Adolescent Experience and Orgasm, whereafter Kinsey writes, quote, "Some of the younger boys who have contributed to the present study have described what is unmistakably sexual orgasm in their pre-adolescent histories, and a large number of adults remember such experience." End quote. Yet the table contains 71 children from 2 months old to 4 years old. How many of these children, even if older, were looking back remembering details like how many orgasms they'd achieved? I'd say probably none. How many 2 or 3 or 4-year-olds were sitting down to discuss and explain their experiences for the Kinsey team surveys? Again, probably none. I can't help but think that where Kinsey wrote, a larger number of adults remember such experience, that he wasn't talking about grown adult men recollecting early sexual experiences, but cryptically writing of the remembered observations of the pedophiles conducting these awful acts. Before Alfred Kinsey, psychologists had rejected the idea that children were sexually viable until the age of puberty. Earlier that century, famed and utterly depraved Sigmund Freud paved the way for Kinsey by pronouncing that children were sexual, but that their sexuality was latent, that is, not acted upon until puberty. Kinsey's report radically altered this perception, spawning an entire industry based on the notion that children have a right to sexual relations at any age. Of no surprise, friend, Sigmund Freud was a big fan, read addict, of cocaine, and this mind-altering substance undoubtedly played a role in his thinking, as I hope you're understanding now, due to his mind's openness and susceptibility to spiritual attack thanks to his frequent drug use, and that, of course, would have influenced and warped Freud's thinking. If you don't believe me, the source for his involvement with cocaine comes from a news outlet you likely believe everything from, CNN. As promised, I said that I would show that Kinsey and his group didn't report the pedophiles not only for the sake of their research, but also because at the end of the day, they thought it would be freeing for children and society alike, and that being sexual was actually quite good for them. Kinsey would write that children could, quote, with the assistance of an experienced adult, enjoy sexual activity from the moment they were born, end quote. Friend, is that sort of language advocating or inviting pedophilia? How does the assisting adult know if an infant is giving consent? Or how do they begin and merely wait for some or do they begin and merely wait for some sign of objection? What if after beginning they can't stop themselves because it's sin that they're committing and sin that they've been tempted into and can't refrain from? What is consent from a young, speaking child when really they're only curious about what you're inviting them into? What is consent if that child has become confused by all the sexual contact and now thinks it's normal? What a complete farce. I can't even write some of the details that Rex King would so scientifically include in his highly incriminating journals. Yet Kingsley would write to King, quote, I congratulate you on the research spirit which has led you to collect data over these many years. Everything you've accumulated must find its way into scientific channels, end quote. My dear friend, there was a spirit leading King and Kinsey into these sick and twisted behaviors, all right, but it wasn't a research spirit. It was the spirit of antichrist. Quote, he did not openly promote pedophilia, but he provided the, quote, scientific, unquote, basis for it. He felt the main problem with adult-child sexual relations was hysteria and overreaction on the part of parents and authorities. He believed that young boys needed the help of older people to develop effective sexual techniques, and he recorded that adult sexual contacts with young girls are the source of pleasure to these girls and may lead to better socio-sexual development in their later lives. His co-author, Wardell Pomeroy, a prominent sexologist, has written that the Kinsey research uncovered, quote, many beautiful and mutually satisfying relationships between fathers and daughters, unquote. Pomeroy also, in his sex education book, Boys and Sex, refers to the possibility of, quote, loving sexual relationships, unquote, between children and animals, end quote. Gordon Muir, MD, research scientist and editor of Dr. Reisman's Kinsey, Sex and Fraud. As I've researched this topic and the subject of Kinsey, it's looking like he actually was involved in some of the pedophilia, at least as far as observing it in person. But for the sake of brevity, we can safely give him the benefit of the doubt on that because direct contact or not, it's clear that Alfred Kinsey was a sick and satanically inspired man. Another of Kinsey's biographers, one who seemed much more sympathetic than Gaithorne Hardy, revealed that on one occasion, without local anesthetics, Kinsey circumcised himself with his pocket knife. If that isn't the icing on the cake, the next portion will likely suffice. Kinsey, it would turn out, was very much informed of the person and works of Aliester Crowley. Attaining the great beast's day-to-day sex diaries would serve as a bit of an obsession to Kinsey while he visited Europe in 1955. Wardell Pomeroy, who we've mentioned was Kinsey's co-author for Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, had accompanied Kinsey on this trip, and he wrote that Kinsey had hoped to acquire those diaries while in England. He'd even write that Kinsey would excitedly say, quote, "We stand a 50-50 chance of getting them," end quote, in hopes that it would become a, quote, "prized item," end quote, for the Institute's personal library. According to Pomeroy, it would seem that Kinsey was successful due to his having written, quote, 2 weeks after Kinsey had tracked down these papers in England, end quote. Kinsey was also fond of Crowley's poetic works, White Stains and The Scented Gardens of Abdullah the Satirist of Shiraz, which revolved around homosexuality and sexual magic, and neither of which are short poems. Apparently he'd thought of Crowley as, quote, "a brilliant writer," end quote. The Kinsey Institute's own erotic bibliographer, Gershon Ligman, has denied this, but one would then be left wondering why the fixation with securing the sex diaries. And what of Kinsey's visit with his friend Kenneth Anger? Kenneth Anger, whose surname was changed from Engelmeyer, is a disciple and follower of Aliester Crowley, still alive today at 90 years of age. He produced short, devilish films which some considered avant-garde. Sometime in 1947, he'd become a good friend of Kinsey and even aid Kinsey in some of his research. Anger would say of Kinsey's shorthand code, which he utilized for the recording of subjects' sex histories during that research, that it was, quote, "highly reminiscent," end quote, to Anger of Crowley's own sex ritual records. During Kinsey's trip around Europe in 1955, Kinsey would meet Anger at Crowley's Abbey of Tolima in Cefalù, Italy, and they were even photographed together there. This small house was a place of Tolemic worship where Crowley and many others conducted their sex magic rituals during the 1920s. For Anger, being there was very much a pilgrimage, and for Kinsey, it may have in some ways been similar. In any case, Anger was in the house doing restorations to the old oil paint murals which Crowley had done all over the walls. Now many of those murals were horrific in nature with demonic overtones avoiding all subtlety. But worse was that these murals containing pornographic sex magic ceremonies depicted the inclusion of children with adults. Kinsey, as one should now expect, registered no ethical, moral, or humane objection to what he was seeing in the artwork. It should strike you as incomprehensible that Kinsey could condemn those who espouse sexual self-discipline and restraint, as well as the founding moral principles for Western civilization, but he found Crowley's savage child pornography, his homosexual sex magic, and his violent blood and death ritualism to be most open. Some say the reason Crowley was forced to leave Cefalù in 1923 was because then fascist Prime Minister Benito Mussolini was concerned with what he'd heard were, quote, black magic rituals, end quote, involving animal sacrifices and wild orgies, and he didn't want them happening in his country. But other authors, such as Bill Landis, Sandy Robertson, and Richard Cavendish, allude to the reality being that those rituals also involved children. The fact that the very murals within the house depicted that, and the reality which would be welcomed by Kinsey in 1955, which is that the nation of Italy was filled with and totally unconcerned by prostitution, including that of children, lends to the reality that all this was indeed occurring. Some even purport that child sacrifices were occurring at the abbey, but that is obviously difficult to substantiate. And in truth, the activities there were debauched enough as it was to warrant our concern and motivation to flee all things related to what Crowley believed without adding the ritual murder of children to it. Kinsey had begun and maintained a relationship through written letters with an American Nazi propagandist named George Sylvester Viereck. Viereck and Kinsey's common bond was one of erotic books and poetry, and Kinsey had a high opinion of Viereck's own poetic writing. Viereck had also founded a publication called The International, in which Aliester Crowley had been a contributing editor for a time. Because Crowley and Kinsey shared a number of acquaintances such as Anger, Viereck, and the French pedophile René Guillon, and because Kinsey carried out extensive secretive confidential correspondences with sex diarists in Europe and Middle Eastern countries, it is suspected that Aliester Crowley may very well have been one of Kinsey's influences. After all, they not only shared acquaintances, but also some of the same demented sexual obsessions. Pomeroy would write in page 198 of his book that, quote, Kinsey would have done business with the devil himself if it would have furthered his research, end quote. Looking at how all of that research was collected and conducted, it seems quite clear that Kinsey was already doing the devil's business. Even Kinsey's motto, of which he repeated for his sex research colleagues, quote, do your best and let other people react as they will, end quote, certainly upholds the same spirit as Crowley's do what thou wilt. Concluding this segment involving Alfred Kinsey, we see that horrifically much of what is assumed today with regards to normal sexual development in children came from these same studies and has had profound influence in the shaping of sexual education curriculum as well as laws against molestation and even how and when sex education is taught. Kinsey, who so many in authority, yes, even governments, have looked to for expertise on human sexuality, can clearly be seen as not being the source of truth regarding it. One final example of this is the Kinsey scale. This scale or spectrum takes into account both sexual experience and psychosexual reactions to place an individual on the scale from 0 to 6, where 0 is completely heterosexual and 6 is completely homosexual. The additional category of X describes those who have, quote, no sociosexual contacts or reactions, end quote, commonly referred to today as asexuality. This was likely the very inspiration for the scale of maximum spectrum of superhero sexuality I'd seen during my military service. Introducing the scale, Kinsey would write, quote, males do not represent two discrete populations, heterosexual and homosexual. The world is not to be divided into sheep and goats, end quote. Having grown up under Christian Methodist teaching, there's no doubt that Kinsey meant more in that statement than first appears. It seems to have been a statement of sheer defiance towards God, just as the intentions behind all of his research had been. This saddening source of falsehoods regarding our sexuality could not have been more wrong, even though he pompously wrote as if he was the authority. Jesus Christ, who was and is the source of truth and the true authority, spoke of the final judgment with these very words. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Then he will say to those on his left, depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 23, verses 31 to 34, and verses 41 and 46. Just as the serpent in the Garden of Eden had said to the woman, did God really say? The snake spirit that had guided Aliester Crowley had also deceived Alfred Kinsey into believing no such separation would ever happen, while also guiding him. Due to Kinsey's bitterness and resentment towards his own father and towards the God of Christianity, he never came to understand he was oppressed and perhaps even possessed and led far, far astray, and God gave him over to the desires of his own depravity. Therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. The Epistle to the Romans, chapter 1, verses 24 to 25. But the campaign towards the rule of the Antichrist would continue onwards, with Kinsey simply being another disposable pawn of the devil. His purposefully flawed and biased research in the 50s would set the stage for what Harry Hay would accomplish in the 60s. As already mentioned, Hay was a major player in the homosexual movement of the 1960s. But what also needs to be made known is that Hay was also photographed marching in a parade in 1986 wearing a sandwich board that read, quote, NAMBLA walks with me, end quote. If you've already forgotten, NAMBLA stands for North American Man-Boy Love Association. Yes, Hay, in his debauched thinking, was promoting pederasty, or homosexual pedophilia. It makes it very difficult for those in favor of homosexual and transgender rights to separate NAMBLA from their own homosexual liberation movement. One of the most influential people in their cause clearly supported adult-to-child sexual relations. If you do your research, you'll come across the arguments that Hay himself was no pedophile. You'll read that his personal beliefs of anti-assimilation by extension gave him reason to lend some support to NAMBLA. They'll say that in this, Hay actually broke away from the mainstream LGBT movement, which wouldn't condone the beliefs of NAMBLA, or that Hay was coming from a place of anti-assimilation and less about pedophilia itself. They'll likely point to the fact that the organizers of the Stonewall 25 March, which was a homosexual rights march through New York past the United Nations headquarters in 1994, refused to include NAMBLA in their march as incontrovertible proof that they were not aligned with the agenda of NAMBLA. But was this true? Was contempt over NAMBLA's desire to have sex with underage boys really the motivator behind barring them from this very public and highly publicized march, where over 1 million people are said to have participated? Gay rights historian David Thorstad, like Harry Hay, was another activist in the homosexual liberation movement. He was even president of New York's Gay Activist Alliance in the early 70s, which was founded in 1969. At the group's inception, it was actually opposed to age of consent laws which would prohibit adults from having sex with children. The belief, of course, was that sexual liberation was not to be reserved only for men and women of various inclinations, but also for minors and children. In 1979, the Gay Community News published a, quote, statement to the gay liberation movement on the issue of man-boy love, end quote. Quote, the ultimate goal of gay liberation is the achievement of sexual freedom for all, not just equal rights for lesbians and gay men, but also freedom of sexual expression for young people and children, end quote. Sounds a lot like the conclusions Kinsey and Pomeroy arrived at, doesn't it, my dear friend? That was from an article Thorstad wrote in 1991 titled, quote, Man-Boy Love in the American Gay Movement, end quote. It appeared in volume 20 of the Journal of Homosexuality. Thorstad also writes in that article that, quote, boy lovers were involved in the gay movement from the beginning, and their presence was tolerated, end quote. This indicates that there has been a natural and inarguable connection between homosexuality and pedophilia. Pushback did come from within the homosexual movement, but it came primarily from the lesbian feminists who saw it for what it was, child abuse. Thorstad would cite the curator of the International Gay and Lesbian Archives in Los Angeles when he said, quote, a point I've been trying to make is that if we reject the boy lovers in our midst today, we'd better stop waving the banner of the ancient Greeks, of Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Oscar Wilde, Walt Whitman, Horatio Alger, and Shakespeare. We'd better stop claiming them as part of our heritage unless we are broadening our concept of what it means to be gay today, end quote. By this, he was obviously speaking to the pederasty that has been going on throughout the ages, especially within male homosexual communities. It should come as no surprise to you that David Thorstad was also a founding member of NAMBLA. By 1985, NAMBLA was admitted into New York's Council of Lesbian and Gay Organizations, as well as the International Gay Association, now called the ILGA, to incorporate the involvement of lesbians. Friend, NAMBLA advocated for sexual relations between adults and minors. That was no secret. They'd been doing so for years. It's not as if they were able to sneak into these major homosexual rights organizations under some false premise that they were purely supporters of the homosexual agenda. So if their aims were tolerated and likely even accepted, why were they kicked out in 1994 during the International Gay Association's annual World Conference held in New York from June 24th to July 3rd? Was there a change of heart within the upper echelon of the homosexual rights organizers? Was it because they realized just how despicable pederasty actually is? Because it's really just pedophilia and child abuse thinly veiled under some falsehood of historical, cultural normalcy? Quote, in October 1993, Lambda Report, an anti-gay publication in the United States, alerted the U.S. media that the North American Man-Boy Love Association, NAMBLA, was an ILGA member. The United States threatened to seek the revocation of ILGA's consultative status unless ILGA expelled NAMBLA and any other pedophile group. Concerned about losing its consultative status, ILGA decided to comply with U.S. demands. At its annual World Conference held in New York City in June 1994, ILGA expelled 3 pedophile groups: NAMBLA, Project Truth Free Will, and Vereniging Martin. End quote. You read that right, friend. Their decision had nothing to do with morality, but everything to do with political expediency and their own agenda. Conservative North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms led a campaign against the ILGA to have their consultative status with the United Nations removed due to their involvement with pedophile advocacy groups. At the last minute, the ILGA removed those groups in hopes of keeping their influence within the UN. And that is the only reason NAMBLA was not allowed to walk in the Stonewall 25 march held on the 26th of July, 1994. Just looking at that, that's this is just a side note. So this is 1 month after expulsion. Back to the book. Don't believe the lies out there stating otherwise. Homosexuality and pedophilia walk hand in hand, regardless of whether or not every homosexual desires to or chooses to engage in pedophilia. At its core, the agenda is one to turn sexuality on its head. I can only imagine that this is being done by people in hopes that when everything is permissible, when everything's acceptable, when every desire is acted upon by all people, because there will no longer be those of us who abstain from what is wrong, which serves as a reminder to them that there is a right way, they will no longer feel that pang of guilt within their hearts for their sinning against God, who gave them a conscience and an inherent knowledge of what is wrong. But it won't help. We already talked about that. Trying to drown out or silence the alarm call of our need of repentance will never make it go away, nor will it ever excuse us. There's also the reality of the There's also the reality of the spiritual guidance in all of this to do away with God's design, even if at the expense of little children. But if it's not already evident, our society on the whole clearly demonstrates on a day-to-day basis that it sees even precious little children as utterly expendable in the pursuit of pleasure and escape from submission to holy God. It's a shocking connection to admit, isn't it? I know that before I came to Christ, when I was believing that all things were permissible and I was living a life of do what thou wilt, I would never have permitted myself to believe that there was any connection whatsoever between the homosexual rights movement and pedophilia. Thankfully, though, the blinders were removed by the Spirit of God. If you, my friend, need a little more convincing of the very real and debased united front, consider for a moment the words of Michael Swift, who contributed what has been called only a satirical article for, once more, the Gay Community News in February of 1987. Quote, "We shall sodomize your sons, emblems of your feeble masculinity. We shall seduce them in your schools, in your dormitories, in your gymnasiums, in your locker rooms, in your sports arenas, in your seminaries, in your youth groups." End quote. Those in the LGBT point out that conservative and religious groups who've cited this article, even before congressional hearings regarding the gay agenda, purposefully leave out the opening statement by Swift, which testifies that it's not meant to be taken seriously. The statement reads as such, quote, "This essay is an outre, madness, a tragic, cruel fantasy, an eruption of inner rage on how the oppressed desperately dream of being the oppressor." End quote. But there's nothing funny or humorous about the words in this desperate dream of an oppressed individual erupting from repressed inner rage who fantasizes about a world where he is the oppressor. It's altogether shocking and intolerable. We've heard plenty of times of the viciousness of so-called religious conservatives, and if a prominent journal from their side wrote the reverse of this, it would be called hate speech, and all involved would be vilified and put up on charges while having their names dragged through the mud by the mass media. Just think of Duck Commander Patriarch Phil Robertson, who wasn't being even half as hateful as the above article writer, but simply told GQ that a woman's vagina seems more appealing than another man's anus, and that sin makes one do illogical things. The media wanted to hang him. His language may have been coarse, But he was right about the illogicality that stems from sin and giving into temptation. Just look again at Kinsey and how far he was able to sink, and how his staff members are also deranged in their reasoning. In any case, the seduction in all directions of young men, even in seminaries, which are institutions where people earn degrees in theology, the study of God, as well as even adolescent males in youth groups, because a youth group generally hosts boys and girls from both junior and senior high, is exactly what's going on, and exactly what seems to be the aim of the more militant homosexuals. Even lesbian journalist Masha Gessen admitted during a radio interview that the push for gay marriage was actually in hopes of, quote, radically redefining and eventually eliminating it, end quote, speaking of marriage in general. Quote, it's a no-brainer that homosexual activists should have the right to marry, but I also think equally that it's a no-brainer that the institution of marriage should not exist. Fighting for gay marriage generally involves lying about what we are going to do with marriage when we get there, because we lie that the institution of marriage is not going to change, and that is a lie. The institution of marriage is going to change, and it should change, and again, I don't think it should exist, and I don't like taking part in creating fictions about my life. I have 3 kids who have 5 parents, more or less, and I don't see why they shouldn't have 5 parents legally. I met my new partner, and she had just had a baby, and that baby's biological father is my brother, and my daughter's biological father is a man who lives in Russia, and my adopted son also considers him his father. So the 5 parents break down into 2 groups of 3. And really, I would like to live in a legal system that is capable of reflecting that reality, and I don't think that's compatible with the institution of marriage. Even if not every member of the LGBT is aware of or involved with said agendas, they do exist. They are radical, and those who participate in and support the movement are actually helping grease the wheels of something that will go well beyond anything they could have ever imagined. And these agendas are the very same ingredients Crowley prophesied as necessity for the entry of the Antichrist, rampant influx in sodomy and the destruction of God's design for the family, both of which seem very clearly to be deep within the homosexual rights movement. Just think back to Crowley's own words in The World's Tragedy where he cried, quote, let me seduce the boys of England, end quote. Sounds very much like what Michael Swift was only joking about, but the same spirit guides them both. It should also be obvious that Crowley's directions were to also reignite pederasty and pedophilia in Judeo-Christian nations to undermine God's influence there. As stated, he painted magic sex rituals involving children in his Italian abbey, and such things allegedly occurred there. Kinsey's co-author Wardell Pomeroy would write in regards to this very matter, quote, they held group orgies as a part of their ritual and included in them the small children the women had brought with them, end quote. Of course, we've also got the puppets of Satan publishing revolting articles like the one in Salon, which attempts to foster and further the pedophilic agenda through sympathy. A side point I'll only touch on briefly for your consideration is that both the satanically guided Aliester Crowley and Alfred Kinsey allowed their devious perversions to also play out in sadomasochism. We talked earlier of the potential spiritual implications involved in BDSM and how it was evident in any sexual practices devoid of real biblical love. But is the rise in it yet another attack on the glory of God by the devil through his agenda to bring about the Antichrist? Based on the involvement of Crowley and Kinsey with it, I'd say it's quite safe to assume so. Could this be why we see drivel like 50 Shades of Grey appearing on our bestseller lists and in our movie theaters in order that it may entice the masses to partake in it in an attempt to lead them into what is an ungodly replication of beautiful human sexuality? It seems rather likely, does it not? Yet another area in which Aliester Crowley was guided for the agenda of the Antichrist was the synthesis of Western occultism with Eastern mysticism. We have certainly seen this take place within the last 50 years. The snake spirit would have Crowley write in the 4th verse of chapter 1 of the Book of the Law, quote, every number is infinite, there is no difference, end quote. We can all agree about how ludicrous this statement is. But it sounds a lot like the sort of conclusions one would arrive at when overtaken by false spiritual systems, such as dualism, where anything can at once be 2 opposing and contrasting realities. Think good and evil. Sounds ethereal and enchanting, but it's altogether nonsense. Same with the pronouncement by the theoretical physicist Lawrence Krauss that 2 plus 2 can equal 5, which we read about much earlier. It's just as absurd and stems from the same meditations as the above belief given to Crowley. But rather than being cloaked in mysticism, it's coated in pseudoscience. Within a system of such spiritual nonsense where anything can be true, however, we're led onwards to pantheism. After all, for a number to represent both a finite figure as well as be infinite, it would most certainly make sense if in actuality everything was one and the same and part of the same whole. Again, think of the false notion of something being both good and evil at the same time, or that neither then really exists. I can recall a hot yoga class I attended in hopes of giving a good stretch to my hamstrings, where the instructor, who quite possibly thought of herself as an enlightened yogi or spiritual guide, told us deep into a stretch that if we felt any pain, to remind ourselves that there is no such thing as bad sensation, nor is there such a thing as a good sensation. Dualism and false spirituality foisted upon a class of 20-plus people while melodic, trance-inducing music prepared our minds for the inception of a false idea and belief system. How tragic for any participants not standing on the rock of truth or swayed through gullibility by such foolishness. Naturally, Crowley was guided by the devil to encourage rebellion against the established authority, which at the time was often still shaped and fashioned by Christian theological influence. After all, how does one persuade the entirety of earth to fall under one false messiah in the antichrist when a majority are already perfectly satisfied in those who govern them? We see this also today, don't we, friend? A growing mistrust of authorities, be it the government itself, government agencies, and even police who are allegedly mostly racist, hell-bent on oppressing minorities. Christianity itself was, of course, to be rebelled against. That's obviously prevalent all around us today. We see even government itself stomping out Christian influence in the public sector. We see the agenda coming to fruition of a new world order under a global governance system, one easy for a single leader to step into control of, to reign over the entire world. And of course, all of this coincides with people aligning themselves with their supposed will via the philosophy of Telema, which is really only a fabricated lie so that the devil can have all people bend down to his will. He only needs to dispatch his forces to go out into the world and influence people to obey thoughts and feelings they believe are originating from within themselves, while it's actually these demonic entities implanting them either by their own suggestion or through false ideas through various forms of media. The 15th verse of the Book of the Law's first chapter reads, quote, "Now ye shall know that the chosen priest and apostle of infinite space is the prince priest, the beast, and in his woman, called the Scarlet Woman, is all power given. They shall gather my children into their fold. They shall bring the glory of the stars into the hearts of men." End quote. What I find unnerving about this instruction is that, as we've already learned, the Bible often speaks of angels as stars, both those submitted to God and those that are fallen from God. No doubt when this glory of such fallen stars resides in the hearts of mankind, it will be wholly opposed to the things of God. Lastly, I wanted to point out the 17th verse of chapter 3 in the Book of the Law. Quote, "Fear not at all. Fear neither men, nor fates, nor gods, nor anything. Money fear not, nor laughter of the folk folly, nor any other power in heaven, or upon the earth, or under the earth. Nu is your refuge, as Hadit your light, and I am the strength, force, vigor of your arms." End quote. Like with the admonition to not fear God's judgment for using mind-altering substances, we have more false reassurance to not fear God no matter what occurs in the life of the Telemite. I wonder if this has anything to do with the complete obstinateness of unbelievers who will not repent and turn to God during the end times tribulation foretold in the Revelation. Whatever the case, such defiance is definitely ill-advised. Darkest of all, though, is the likelihood that Crowley was calling upon his demonically guided followers to involve themselves with child sacrifice, just as we saw in the pagan nations which God judged through the armies of Israel. In Crowley's Magic in Theory and in Practice awaits a spiritually dark chapter 12 called Of the Bloody Sacrifice and Matters Cognate, cognate meaning of a simpler nature. Once again, we see that the spiritually deceived Crowley has an extremely limited and twisted understanding of Holy Scripture and even the ideas therein, although he's led to refer to them directly to give spiritual credibility to his demonic rituals. What he says from all of this is that a blood sacrifice has, quote, from time immemorial been the most considered part of magic, end quote. Let us now work our way through this passage. It's a lengthy one to cite, but seeing all of the details will give you a clearer understanding when confronted with the defenses of this passage by Crowley's loyal supporters. Quote, in any case, it was the theory of the ancient magicians that any living being is a storehouse of energy varying in quantity according to the size and health of the animal, and in quality according to its mental and moral character. End quote. I think we can all agree that animals themselves really have no sense of morality. A dog will just as soon defend its owner from an enemy as jump up on the table and eat his dinner when the master leaves the room, unless trained otherwise, and only appear troubled by its own actions when scolded by that master upon their return. Supposed morality Crowley speaks of likely alludes to the fact that God had specifically told the Israelites to sacrifice a year-old unblemished lamb, that is, a lamb pure and white and free of any spots, for the atonement of their sins. To a character like Aliester Crowley, the use of such an animal by the Israelites would point to a universally powerful, magical truth able to be harnessed by any practitioner, even when devoid of anything to do with the one true God. Quote, at the death of the animal, this energy is liberated suddenly. The animal should therefore be killed within the circle or the triangle, as the case may be, so that its energy cannot escape. An animal should be selected whose nature accords with that of the ceremony. Thus, by sacrificing a female lamb, one would not obtain any appreciate quantity of the fierce energy useful to a magician who was invoking Mars. In such a case, a ram would be more suitable, and this ram should be a virgin. The whole potential of its original total energy should not have been diminished in any way. End quote. For Crowley, who was right in understanding that sex was spiritual, but wrong when believing it to be magical, a virgin would obviously have more of its initial magical power, not yet spent during sex. I suppose then that sacrificing a goat you'd copulated with would therefore be less useful magically. I mention this because, as one could expect, Crowley involved bestiality in his sex magic. Arthur Lyons would state in page 80 of his book, Satan Wants You, The Cult of Devil Worship in America, quote, in 1920, with a small band of followers, Crowley moved into a farmhouse near Cephalus, Sicily, and founded his Abbey of Tolima, from which he hoped to see his gospel spread. It was here, away from the prying eyes of society, that he began to revive barbaric rites that had not been practiced since the time of the Dionysian cults in ancient Greece. During one ritual in 1921, he induced a he-goat to copulate with his constant female companion and scarlet woman, Leah Hersig, then slit the animal's throat at the moment of orgasm. End quote. Quote, for the highest spiritual working, one must accordingly choose that victim which contains the greatest and purest which contains the greatest and purest force. A male child of perfect innocence and high intelligence is the most satisfactory and suitable victim. For evocations, it would be more convenient to place the blood of the victim in the triangle, the idea being that the spirit might obtain from the blood this subtle but physical substance which was the quintessence of its life in such a manner as to enable it to take on a visible and tangible shape. Now, when Crowley speaks of a male child, is he speaking of a young male animal? Why not be more specific and clear? He was speaking about rams, so why not use the term kid when he speaks of innocence? Why not use the term kid? When he speaks of innocence, is he, as God intentioned, only speaking of the absence of physical blemishes? When he speaks of high intelligence, is he talking of an abnormally smart child ram, one who can jump through hoops and find treats hidden under turned-over bowls? That's what I think of when I hear about intelligent barnyard animals. Or is he talking cryptically about something else this entire time, trying purposefully to keep his words' true meanings veiled and only as clear as necessary? When I think of an innocent male child of high intelligence, I think of a young human boy who's kept himself from too much mischief. Is that just me? Let's continue. Quote, those magicians who object to the use of blood have endeavored to replace it with incense. For such a purpose, the license of Abremelin may be burnt in large quantities. Dittany of Crete is also a valuable medium. Both these incenses are very Catholic in their nature and suitable for almost any materialization. But the bloody sacrifice, though more dangerous, is more efficacious, and for nearly all purposes, human sacrifice is the best. End quote. Thanks, Aliester, for clearing all that confusion up for us, just in case we thought you were talking about rams still. But is he talking about just a little blood or killing somebody? Quote, the truly great magician will be able to use his own blood, or possibly that of a disciple, and that without sacrificing the physical life irrevocably. End quote. Okay, so apparently you don't need to kill yourself or another human being, but if you're unskilled at all this, you might sacrifice not just a little physical life through the shedding of some blood, but you may end up sacrificing the whole life irrevocably, which means, quote, without being able to go back, end quote. I'm really glad we're getting to the bottom of this. Quote, an example of this sacrifice is given in chapter 44 of Liber 333. This Mass may be recommended generally for daily practice. Quote, one last word on this subject. There is a magical operation of maximum importance, the initiation of a new eon. When it becomes necessary to utter a word, the whole planet must be bathed in blood. Before man is ready to accept the law of Telema, the great war must be fought. This bloody sacrifice is the critical point of the world ceremony of the proclamation of Horus, the crowned and conquering child, as the Lord of the Eon. This whole matter is prophesied in the book of the law itself. Let the student take note and enter the ranks of the host of the sun. End quote. You may recall, friend, that the third chapter of the book of the law spoke of a brutal and violent conquest over the earth where much blood was poured out. What exactly is being called for, I cannot say. After doing a little digging, I did discover, though, that magic in theory and practice is the third part of a larger work called Magic Liber ABA, Book 4. As the Book of the Law was given to Crowley by an intermediary of Satan, or perhaps by Satan himself under the name of Aiwass, this book came to him through a spirit which identified itself as Abeldiz. This visitation came in November of 1911. The book was published in the winter of 1912 to 1913. Could the Great War, to be fought to be a prophetic foretelling, could the Great War to be fought be a prophetic foretelling of the actual Great War, which began in July of 1914? A third footnote on page 88 of an electronic edition by Celifay Press in 2004, based on the 1930 publishing by La Crown Press, seems to state this when it says, quote, this paragraph was written in the summer of 1911, EV, just 3 years before its fulfillment, end quote. 11 million combatants died, along with 7 million civilians. That would make for a lot of human sacrifice, and indeed, this would seem to be the launching point towards the new eon from which we will see, quote, the proclamation of Horus, the crowned and conquering child, as Lord of the eon, end quote. Sure enough, Western civilization would soon be ready to accept the law of Telema. If one great war wasn't enough, we had a second only 2 decades later. Now the devil cannot see the future, and so was not able to communicate these ideas to Crowley with absolute foreknowledge, but the devil, as already noted, is incredibly skilled at manipulating whole masses of people and individuals themselves. When one looks at the elements which led up to World War I, how it was a powder keg of alliances ready to go off at the striking of a single match, it's no trouble whatsoever for the devil and his legion of lying spirits to organize and guide all those pieces of animosity into place. Of course, there is also the possibility that this foretold great war, where the world is bathed in blood, is yet to come. Who can really say but God himself? Quote, actual ceremonial details likewise may be left to experiment. The method of killing is practically uniform. The animal should be stabbed to the heart, or its throat severed, in either case by the knife. All other methods of killing are less efficacious. Even in the case of crucifixion, death is given by stabbing. End quote. As mentioned earlier, Crowley would erroneously point to the stabbing of Christ with a spear in his side as being what killed him. Likewise, here, death by crucifixion was usually through asphyxiation, often sped up by the breaking of the shins, so that the punished could no longer hold up their body weight to breathe. Stabbing would have only been used as a further means to expedite the process, but only when necessary. Quote, one may remark that warm-blooded animals only are used as victims, with two principal exceptions. The first is the serpent, which is only used in a very special ritual. The second, the magical beetles of Liber Legis. See Part 4. One word of warning is perhaps necessary for the beginner. The victim must be in perfect health, or its energy may be as it were poisoned. It must also not be too large. The amount of energy disengaged is almost unimaginably great and out of all anticipated proportion to the strength of the animal. Consequently, the magician may easily be overwhelmed and obsessed by the force which has let loose. It will then probably manifest itself in its lowest and most objectionable form. The most intense spirituality of purpose is absolutely essential to safety. In evocations, the danger is not so great, as the circle forms a protection, but the circle in such a case must be protected, not only by the names of God and the invocations used at the same time, but by a long habit of successful defense. If you are easily disturbed or alarmed, or if you have not yet overcome the tendency of the mind to wander, it is not advisable for you to perform the bloody sacrifice. Yet it should not be forgotten that this, and that other art which we have dared darkly to hint, are the supreme formulae of practical magic. End quote. Friend, remember where I said it seemed like Crowley was being cryptic in his writing to avoid giving away precisely what he's depicting, especially concerning the idea of the human sacrifice of children? Is this what he meant when referring to, quote, that other art which we have dared darkly to hint, end quote, which should be the supreme formulas of practical magic? Which would be the supreme formulas of practical magic? Quote, you are also likely to get into trouble over this chapter unless you truly comprehend its meaning, end quote. In this closing line, we see a warning. Is Crowley warning the initiate that if the above is not done properly, there will be consequences? Or is he saying that if they misinterpret what he's getting at here and they go through with it all, there will be consequences? In direct relation to, quote, a male child of perfect innocence and high intelligence is the most suitable sacrifice, end quote, on page 87 in the 1930 republication of Magic by La Crown Press, their footnote reads, quote, it appears from the magical records of Frater Perderabo, another alias of Crowley, that he made this particular sacrifice on an average about 150 times every year between 1912 EV and 1928, end quote. That equates to an unbelievable number of 2,400 sacrifices. It's honestly hard to fathom even Crowley committing so fiendish a feat, but even 2,400 animal sacrifices sounds hard to believe. Whatever the case, it's hard to escape that he spoke of male children of perfect innocence and high intelligence being the best sacrifice, when this doesn't seem to speak of animals whatsoever, especially in conjunction with his statement only 2 paragraphs later that human sacrifices are the best for the bloody sacrifice. Is this why Crowley would venture off to the areas of the world which were somewhat more disconnected from more modernized society of the day? Was he seeking out places where disappearing children would be more difficult to publicize or even trace? Or were the bloody rituals only drawing blood and not necessarily taking the entire life? Whatever the case, Crowley's faithful defenders can be found on the internet denying that human child sacrifice was ever the intention of this chapter, although it certainly seemed apparent. It was allegedly just a concealed joke he was making about his own habits of masturbation, and that the, quote, innocent and pure male children, end quote, were only his sperm. They point to his warning at the end to the reading audience that they'll find themselves in trouble if they don't understand his meaning as proof of this. But I haven't been able to find any sources whatsoever where Crowley confesses the above citations to be a hoax and a gag, only hearsay from his supporters. Besides which, the rituals he described contain blood, intelligence, stabbing, and a variety of other matters which you can't get out of sperm. Imagine trying to stab the microscopic for a ritual. What of the reality that sperm have a 50-50 chance of creating a male or female after fertilization of the egg due to the presence of either an X or Y chromosome, which bonds with the X chromosome present in the egg? How does one then refer to sperm as a male child? Sperm doesn't seem to fit whatsoever. All those statements in defense only serve as examples of laughable excuses. No, my dear friend, it seems quite likely that Aliester Crowley was indeed describing and defining child sacrifice, or at the very least, the drawing of their blood for the sake of his demonic rituals. The historical practice of human sacrifice was well documented in an unfortunate and misguided book called The Golden Bow by an anthropologist named James George Fraser and published in 1890. Crowley would cite it as an inspiration for his work in magic. We see that where he writes, quote, "The practical details of the bloody sacrifice may be studied in various ethnological manuals, but the general conclusions are summed up in Fraser's Golden Bow, which is strongly recommended to the reader." End quote. He mentions the work over a half a dozen times. And even if he wasn't actually calling for the sacrifice of human children, how many demented fools given over to Satan have read his words and taken them literally? I think it would be a safe wager to assume thousands around the globe throughout the past several decades at a bare minimum. How totally and utterly careless of him, not to mention all the others murdering people, quote, in the name of Satan, end quote, or because they sincerely believed, quote, the devil told me to, end quote. Go look and you'll see countless such accounts of that, and they aren't all murderers attempting to beat the system with a plea of insanity. Just think of the pedophile and child sacrifice rings alluded to earlier. Can you imagine anything more evil and wicked, and thus satanic, than little children being sexually enslaved and emotionally and physically abused, even being locked in showers with boiling water spraying on them while they cry and scream for mercy from their demonized captors? If you don't know what that is a direct reference to, you need to look into it and follow the breadcrumbs, being willing not to dismiss where they lead. The point is, these diabolical, demonically inspired activities are indeed happening, and they are happening amidst not only the lowliest of backwards cultures, but also among the most powerful and prominent people and organizations in the most sophisticated regions. Aliester Crowley had, of course, first sought to fulfill his mission within his homeland of the United Kingdom, but it was near his death when he realized that the United States of America was riper and more ready for the philosophies of Thelema and do what thou wilt. In The Confessions of Aliester Crowley, which was most notably an autobiography written throughout Crowley's life and then compiled and finalized late, 2 decades after his death in 1947, Crowley would write, quote, "I turn therefore to America from an expiring solar system to a nebulous mass which I expect to develop into an organized galaxy. The elements of the United States are heterogeneous in a manner unprecedented in history. Every race, language, and creed of Europe is represented. All Americans are eager for power in one form or another. No humbug so outrageous as to deter them from running after the new religion. Their dauntless innocence persuades me that just as soon as they have acquired the critical faculty, they will progress spiritually more swiftly and sanely than has ever been known." End quote. Certainly, just as the United States of America has been at the forefront of nearly every great achievement in the last 2 centuries as a shining example to the world, it has also become the solid example of what it means for a nation blessed and favored by God to be turning her back on him. The very immorality called for by the devil through Aliester Crowley has very much engulfed that once great nation, and every nation under the influence of her pop culture has followed suit in a quick-time death march, altogether in a downward spiral, while those opposed to God view it as the greatest emblem of humanity's progress towards equality, tolerance, and liberty of any sort for all. The prophecies delivered by the snake spirit, who is none other than the devil, are coming to pass before our very eyes and within our very generations. Astonishingly, God is not at all surprised, and he promised this era would come nearly 2,000 years ago through his own true prophet, the Apostle Paul. The coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan with all power and false signs and wonders, and with all wicked deception for those who are perishing, because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. Therefore God sends them a strong delusion, so that they may believe what is false, in order that all may be condemned, who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. The second epistle to the Thessalonians, chapter 2, verses 9 to 12. My dear friend, the lawless one referred to here is the antichrist, or child of Horus, according to Crowley, which the knowing servants of Satan wish to bring forth. We need not go on listing all of the anecdotal evidence of the despicable acts which God hates, but which are occurring in our world. Certainly you have seen enough to know that Aliester Crowley had indeed received his orders from a powerful demonic being opposed to the word of God that was laid out for the Israelites and for the followers of Christ long ago. Surely you see the prophecy from the Apostle Paul given by the Holy Spirit centuries beforehand is also true. If you have been deceived into believing the way of the world is a wonderful thing, and that the God of the Bible has no business ruling over it, it is because he has permitted the strong delusion to overtake you. But the promised condemnation is only for those who will keep resisting and not turn themselves over into the loving hands of God. That does not have to be you, too. You have had, quote, pleasure in unrighteousness, end quote. But so have I, and by God's grace, to his glory, he took a sinner such as I, and in his mercy gave me the faith to see and believe. If I could have been shown such mercy and accepted this gift, then surely the same can happen for you. All you have to do is accept it. I pray that you do. Oh, please, my dear friend, do accept it. Thanks for listening to this video, and I hope that it blesses you. Please do share with others so they may have the opportunity to understand this incredible truth. Be blessed.